I'm Dennis Mitchell, Vice Provost for Faculty Advancement, and I'm excited to welcome you to today's panel. It's entitled How to be a Visible LGBTQ+ Ally. This session was inspired by feedback that we received from students, staff, and faculty last year while we were producing the Columbia University LGBTQ+ guide. Our goal for today is to be in conversation, to give potential allies a conceptual understanding of the broader LGBTQ+ landscape, to give an overview of common terminology, and to share specific actions that we can all take to demonstrate our allyship. Let's welcome our panel. I'll start with Ixchel Rosal, who is the Associate Vice President for Student Life in the Office of University Life, where she collaborates closely with students, administrators, and faculty across the university on student life issues and student-driven projects. Next, we have Vanessa Gonzalez-Siegel, who is the Associate Director of Multicultural Affairs and LGBTQ+ outreach in undergraduate student life. She oversees LGBTQ at Columbia, which provides LGBTQ group advising, events, education, advocacy, and resources for LGBTQ students at Columbia. Next, we have Nikita. Shepard is a graduate student in the Department of History. They explore histories of gender and sexuality, LGBTQ community, social movements, data and surveillance, and radical politics in the 20th century United States and beyond. Thank you to our panel, and again, welcome to all of you. And Ixchel, I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Dennis. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. Thank you to your team for organizing us, and thank you to all of you for joining us. I think the fact that we have all carved out time for this important conversation is really a great marker, a great testament to the fact that we have resisted the pull to render this conversation unnecessary, because there is a really strong pull to not talk about these issues, to not make them visible. So I appreciate the title of this session, and I think this is a great sort of first step to marking out that space and carving out the time and place for this important conversation. So thank you all for doing that and for resisting the pull to go invisible here. I'm going to, next slide, please. I'm going to walk you through what we planned for you today. I'm going to offer you all some framing pieces for our conversation, then I'll turn it over to Vanessa, who will walk us through the language pieces, which are really important. It is truly a living language and it changes almost on the daily. So staying up to speed on what the current practices around language is really key to this work. And then we'll pull in Nikita for a conversation around what does it mean to be an ally and really being visible and taking action. And then we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. So next slide, please. So to offer some framing comments, I wanted to start by saying that early on in our planning sessions for today's event, we talked about wanting to start at a certain point, and that point is that what we're here to talk about is validation and support of the LGBTQ community. This is not about, what is the moral standing, or, is this opinion? Is this a preference? Is this, somebody's choice? We're not negotiating those questions. We're starting at a different point. And where we are is that there is inherent value and goodness to the LGBTQ community. They are valued members of our community. And how do we support and validate this community? I think it is important to note, however, that there are other spaces, including on our campus, but certainly throughout the country and certainly globally, where those other more foundational questions are being asked, and that those are traumatic conversations, and that some of our students, as well as some of our colleagues, some of our faculty and staff, come from families, communities, regions of the world where those conversations are prevalent. And so just to be mindful of where people are coming from. Another framing piece that I wanted to offer is that this is also an opportunity for all of us, irrespective of our identity, to think about our own relationship to homophobia and transphobia. And I propose that this is something that these forces are forces that we've actually all bumped up against at the very least, because we have all had to figure out either consciously or unconsciously what is our sexual orientation and what is our gender identity. And we have had to do that within the context of a culture that is deeply homophobic and transphobic. And so I propose that all of us, again, irrespective of our identity, have been mindful of those forces, have tried to protect ourselves against those forces, because that oppression is brutal and too often lethal. And it starts at a very early age, and the bullying that we see in K through 12 is an example of the brutality of that oppression. And the thing that's important, I think, to note, or one thing that's important to note about that, the bullying piece, is that the young people who are targeted for the bullying are young people who not only identify as LGBTQ, but who are also perceived to identify as LGBTQ. So again, it doesn't matter what your identity is, you may still bump up against these forces. And there have probably all been times when we have negotiated how we present ourselves, right? What we share about ourselves, how we present our gender identity or our families, knowing that we may face these forces of oppression and have made certain choices. And unless we unpack those moments, we may develop a blind spot in our abilities to be true and effective and visible allies. So what I'm saying is, the more relaxed that you can be around your own identities, the better able you will be to stand up and be visible as an ally to this community, because you will be less concerned about bumping up against homophobia and transphobia. So there is work for all of us to do in investigating and interrogating the ways that those forces have impacted our own choices, irrespective of our identities. Visibility and assumptions about who is impacted, I think, go hand in hand, right? That again, because of the nature of homophobia and transphobia, people make all kinds of choices and present themselves in all kinds of ways and tell all kinds of stories about themselves. And so we can't assume who holds and does not hold this identity. But we should know, and this, I'm actually bumping down to the last point here, that there are LGBTQ plus students, faculty, and staff across our university, in every department, in every classroom, at all times, virtual or otherwise. And so we can always assume that if we're in a setting with other people, that there is someone at the very least negotiating this identity, if not full on stepping into it. And then bumping up to the second to last point, it is also important to note that that as people are navigating their lives as LGBTQ plus folks, they are also negotiating a racial identity, a class identity, an identity in relationship to ability status, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is no singular or universal LGBTQ plus experience, that all other social identities also impact this experience as well. Next slide, please. So I wanted to share just a few pieces about the landscape here. So a few comments about the national landscape and then some survey data. In terms of federal legislation, it has not been a linear. It has not been a linear path to progress here. That we've taken 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Also, it's inconsistent in terms of what's happening at the state level and the local level, and that there are many folks within the LGBTQ community who are really navigating big legal struggles in this very moment. And in particular, one struggle that's at the forefront right now is healthcare for transgender youth and access to healthcare for transgender youth. And whether or not they are entitled or have the right to that healthcare. So that's an example of some of the complexities and the ways that while we see progress on one front, we see real struggle on another front. And so it has not been a linear or smooth progression to rights. Also, I wanted to point out that for some of our students, COVID has forced a return to home, and that may be a problematic space to be in. Again, just sort of depending on the nature of the relationships with family members, with community members, and even more broadly, some of our students and some of our colleagues may be in a particular position in this moment that is really outside of our sort of liberal bubble here at Columbia and in New York City. And again, that's something that to be mindful of. So some statistics that we wanted to share with you, just to share some data, as I know that can help illuminate some of the points that I'm making. I'm going to share some points from the 2015 US Transgender Survey, which was conducted by the National Center for Transgender Equality. Just a few points to share here. 1 in 6 respondents who had ever been employed in the year that the survey was done reported losing a job because of their gender identity or expression. In the year previous, 27% of those who held or applied for a job reported being fired, denied promotion, or not being hired for the job they applied for because of their gender identity or expression. 15% of respondents who had a job in the past year were vulnerable, harassed, physically attacked, or sexually assaulted at work because of their gender identity or expression. And nearly 1/4, 23% of those who held a job in the previous year reported other forms of mistreatment based on their gender identity or expression. So that's a bit about the national landscape. Bringing it a little closer to home here, I'm going to share a few points from a couple of surveys that were done. One was done by the Queer Trans Advisory Board in 2018. And this was a survey of undergraduate students, students specifically at Columbia College and C's undergrad. And then I'll share a slide, from the 2018 SAC report, which comes out of Senate on the student quality of life. So next slide, please. I'm not going to read these stats to you. You all can read them on your own, but we just wanted to highlight a few things. We highlighted some of the things related to their academic experience, so what's happening in the classroom, and you can see that there are some challenges there around pronouns and the use of pronouns and in getting people's gender identity correct. But I think it's also important to note some of the other pieces there that LGBT folks are navigating while they're in the classroom, which is the sort of threat of financial precariousness should their family find out, and also the feelings of loneliness and isolation. Now, many students are experiencing these feelings. However, LGBT folks are experiencing them at a higher level. So there's clearly some work to do there. Next slide, please. So those stats, again, were related to the undergraduate experience. So pulling back here a little bit and sharing university-wide some stats related to the overall quality of life. And you can see here again that LGBT folks overall, so this is across all of Columbia schools, are experiencing a lower quality of life, or overall satisfaction is lower. And then I wanted to give you a heads up that actually, hopefully later this spring or perhaps early in the fall, we will be releasing the results of the 2020 Student Wellbeing Survey, which has some interesting stats related to LGBT folks, students specifically, sense of belonging on campus. And so keep your eye out for that as well. So I'm wrapping up here. I'm about to turn it over to Vanessa, but I just wanted to close by saying that what we're talking about here is a sizable population. and a population that is really finding its voice. That's sort of inconsistently experienced, that some LGBT folks are very visible and very vocal while others are still in the closet. So there is definitely a spectrum of experience there, but collectively it is a community that is finding its voice, though certainly in need of allyship, and invite you to the table to serve in that role. So with that, I will turn it over to Vanessa to walk us through some pieces around the language. Thank you, Vanessa.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ixchel. And again, thanks to Office of Faculty Advancement for inviting me. Just to quickly reintroduce myself, my name is Vanessa Gonzalez-Siegel. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the Associate Director for Multicultural Affairs and LGBTQ Outreach in Undergraduate Student Life. My role is largely supporting LGBTQ students within the undergraduate CC&C's undergrad. And I'm going to be walking through folks through living language and little pieces about language and terminology. Oh, thank you for the note. Can folks hear me okay? Awesome, great, thank you. Also, as a heads up, I do have a cat, so she's very active, so she pops up behind me. I apologize for the distraction. So the language that we'll be talking about today is from our CU Safe Zone training, which is a larger 3-hour in person and 2 hours on Zoom intensive around foundational issues and understanding to support LGBTQ communities at Columbia and beyond. And the reason why we utilize the phrasing of living language as opposed to terminology or opposed to terms and definitions is a few different reasons. One, as to what Ixchel alluded to earlier, language is consistently evolving. That language is changing, it is becoming more robust, and then also that folks utilize language differently. Terminology that we may use at Columbia may look different at other institutions in New York City, specifically, and the language that students use at Columbia may also be different from language that students use at NYU, at Fordham, at CUNY, etc. Also to acknowledge that the way in which we're going to be talking about gender and sexuality in this conversation is being conducted in English in the United States, and that informs the way in which we talk about these things, and not to frame our understanding of sexuality and gender and the terms that we use as more correct or more right than others, but more reflecting that this is language that is currently being used by students within our communities and also our colleagues as well. The first thing that I do want to touch on is examining sexuality and gender. Oftentimes sexuality and gender are thought of as one thing, right? So how you identify, what's your gender identity and what's your sexuality? But sexuality and gender have a lot more nuance and a lot more complexity for folks. So with sexuality, there's sexual orientation, sexual identity, and sexual behavior. Sexual orientation refers to the inner feeling of who we are or are not attracted to sexually and or emotionally. Sexual identity refers to how we call ourselves in terms of sexuality, right? The word in which we use to describe ourselves. And then there's sexual behavior. So what we do or not do and with whom. Oftentimes these things are thought of as the same thing, right? So for example, if someone is a woman, they would have inner feelings towards folks who are men. They would then identify as heterosexual and therefore exclusively have sex with men. However, sexuality and the ways in which people engage with other folks can be a lot more complicated. This said person could have orientation and feelings for multiple genders, and therefore identifies as bisexual or pansexual, and therefore have sex with folks of multiple genders, right? So sexuality is very complicated and not as linear. Similar with gender, there's gender identity, gender expression, and gender attribution. So gender identity, similar to sexual identity, refers to the word that we use to describe ourselves: man, woman, trans woman, non-binary, etc. Then there's gender expression. So the ways in which we communicate our gender to others, and whether that be through the way we dress, the way we do our hair, things like that, and how we present ourselves. Then there's gender attribution. So the ways in which folks perceive our gender, regardless of how we actually identify. Gender attribution is really important to think about when we think about pronouns, when we think about privilege and access to different spaces, and things like that. And so Another reason why we call living language is because folks understand and utilize these terms differently. And so oftentimes when thinking about LGBTQ inclusion and supporting students and staff and colleagues, a lot of it's around language. And language is important and language matters, but it's also important to mimic the language that folks give you and to follow that lead. Next slide, please. And some terms that have already been used, but just want to give a framing for folks who may not be familiar with what these words mean. Transgender, or trans for short, is an umbrella term for people whose gender identity and or gender expression differs from their sex assigned at birth. And then there is, I'm actually going to switch to cisgender first. Cisgender are people whose sex assigned at birth matches their gender identity. There's a note in there about the prefix cis. If folks have a science background, cis meaning on the same side, right? Where trans meaning different than, right? So folks who are cisgender identify with the same gender that they're assigned at birth, whereas trans folks identify differently. And that's really, and that came out of cisgender is not a new word, but I think it's getting a lot of popularity and a lot of use in academic spaces. It's a word that came out of the trans community because there was never, but prior, a way to talk about trans folks and people who weren't trans without insinuating isolation or otherness, right? It was trans people and then normal people, trans people, and then everybody else. So it came out of a need to talk about transness, talk about the lived experiences of trans people, and talk about power, privilege, and oppression without alienating or othering trans folks in the conversation. Another term that we're going to talk about is non-binary. Non-binary is an umbrella term used to describe gender identities that do not fit within a gender binary of man and woman. Non-binary, there are a plethora of other non-binary gender identities that fall under there. Non-binary, just as a note, is the most common used at Columbia's campus. Some other things that may fall under that category are genderqueer, gender nonconforming, gender fluid, and things like that. But specifically at Columbia, non-binary is the most commonly used by our students in particular. Another note is that, oh, Nikita, sorry, my apologies. Nikita, did you want to add?
No, I'd say go right ahead.
Great. And just to wrap up, if folks want to learn more about terminology or living language or engage more in a conversation around terms, definitely we invite you to ask questions in our Q&A section later on today, but also our CU Safe Zone training as a continued educational resource.
Nikita, I think you're up.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. There's a ton of things you could be doing with your sunny Zoom afternoon, and it really means a lot to us that you're here with us. So again, my name is Nikita Shepard. I use gender neutral pronouns, they and them, and I'm a PhD student here in the Department of History. And since we know that a lot of you who are here are looking for kind of concrete suggestions about what are things that I can do to be an ally, I thought through that and I wanted to share a few things that I thought were helpful in thinking through some of the issues that you might encounter. So, first, I wanted to, since we've heard from Vanessa about some of these complexities of language and some of the ways that that comes up, to offer a few concrete suggestions about what we can do in the classroom or with our coworkers at Columbia. And I would sum those up as around language and pronouns, model and offer options. So how do you navigate pronouns in a classroom setting? It's a controversial question. And unfortunately, there's not a sort of standard received best practices answer for all situations. So on the one hand, neglecting to acknowledge or share preferred pronouns can convey a lack of concern for LGBTQ students, or it can lead to you and your students making incorrect assumptions or misgendering others. But on the other hand, compelling people to share their preferred pronouns can put people on the spot, can create pressure, or can leave gender nonconforming people feeling singled out. So how do we navigate this? Well, first, you can model options for pronoun disclosure. If you're on Zoom, you can edit your profile name, as those of us on the panel have done, to include your preferred pronouns. You can do this in your email signature too. When you're introducing yourself on the first day of class or work, you can mention your preferred pronouns to establish that as a normal thing to share. But we encourage you to make sharing pronouns normal, but not mandatory. So for example, If you're doing a go round in a staff meeting or in a first day of class, you can say something like, I'd like everybody to share the name that you'd like to be called, your year, school, major, whatever relevant information. And if you'd like to, you can share your preferred gender pronouns, though it's totally up to you. This creates the space for people who want to ensure that others know their correct pronoun, but it doesn't compel people who aren't comfortable sharing to do so. Depending on the context you're in, it might be useful in this introduction to sort of briefly explain the rationale behind sharing preferred gender pronouns. This may not be necessary in an institutional context like Columbia, but before I came here, I was an MA student and assistant teacher at Middle Tennessee State University for 2 years, where the sort of normalized culture around sharing gender pronouns was not really as much a part of the broader conversation. So it was useful for me to sort of just explain a little bit what I meant by that when doing that sort of introduction. One risk to note that may come up is that if you offer this possibility and a go-round starts, if the first person who shares their name and information about them doesn't share a preferred pronoun, perhaps unthinkingly, they might not be used to it, then as the go-round proceeds, perhaps no one else does, which might leave it up to non-binary or gender non-conforming people to kind of break the mold and speak up. So if you notice this happening, after a couple of people have shared, you can pipe in with a reminder that you encourage folks to share their preferred gender pronouns if they want to, just so that it's back on the table. Another thing that you can do is you can offer students a chance to disclose to you, but not to the entire class, their gender pronouns on the first day. For example, you could have students fill out note cards or an online survey in which you offer people the opportunity to share the pronouns by which they'd like you to refer to them. There's some strategies that might work in certain settings, but not as well in others. So for example, on the first day of one of my discussion sections as a TA, I thought it would be a good icebreaker to have folks divide into pairs, introduce themselves to each other, and then come back to the large group and introduce their partner to the whole group. And I was thinking that this would model people asking pronouns and using them in the third person to describe someone else. So this worked great in an Introduction to Sexuality Studies class, in which most people were pretty familiar with the practice of preferred pronouns and respecting them. But in another history class I taught that didn't have that theme, it was kind of a disaster where people were misgendering others to the whole group from the first day. So you might want to think about sort of assembling a toolbox of different options and considering what approaches might or might not work, depending on the setting that you're in and the audience that you're working with. And as a last suggestion, you can announce your intention. You can do this either verbally on the first day or in the syllabus to the class in print, saying something as simple as, my goal is to make this class inclusive for people of all gender and sexual identities. So here's how I'm trying to do that, and this is what I'm asking of everyone to help me with that. Throughout the semester, please let me know if there's things that I can improve or ways that I can support you to feel respected and do your best learning. Saying something like that can let people know that you take it seriously and that you're open to feedback, and gives a standard by which you can be held accountable and help learn from others as well. So a second suggestion I would make for allyship is to, echoing things that we've heard so far, is to check assumptions. So here's some examples. So just because your coworker has mentioned that they're in a relationship with someone who they describe with certain pronouns, doesn't mean that you can assume that they're heterosexual. I one time had a coworker who I knew strongly identified with the LGBTQ community, but talked about her boyfriend all the time. And at first I was kind of confused until later on I learned that her boyfriend was trans and had transitioned during the relationship. And I felt embarrassed that I had made some ignorant assumptions about her and her identity. In the classroom, a student who opts not to share their preferred pronouns, they might be doing that because they're cisgendered and they just didn't think about it. Or it might be because they're struggling to define their gender identity and they're unsure of what to say. Or it may be that they're testing the waters to see if your class feels like a safe enough space for them to be open about who they are. Similarly, one of your students or your coworkers may themselves identify as lesbian or gay or bisexual, but not actually have much context or act as a supportive ally for transgender or other gender nonconforming folks. And echoing the language piece, while the definitions that we offer sort of differentiating gender and sexuality may sound clear-cut, in our lived experiences, it may not be that straightforward. So it's not uncommon for people to inhabit different gender and sexual identities at different times in their lives. Sometimes this might be as people come out of the closet from a less to a more authentic way of living. But sometimes it's because what's authentic and true for someone changes over the course of their lives. So what's the linking theme between all of these examples? The assumptions that we make can get in the way of really hearing people and recognizing that every person is the authority over their own life and their own identity. So the more that we can become aware of and discard the assumptions that we make about other people's gender and sexuality, the more that we can create inclusive environments in our classrooms and our workplaces. So the third thing I wanted to mention, audit your curriculum. Okay, so there's a lot of tools that we can use to check out our curricula, our syllabi, to make them more inclusive. Now, I'm in the field of history, and so there's a lot of fairly straightforward resources on how to do this in terms of teaching modules and pedagogical resources for integrating LGBTQ history, whether it's in K-12 or in university level. But what about in other disciplines? It may be a little bit less straightforward. So I'll just, I don't know where all of you are from in the different parts of the university, but I'll just mention a few examples. So let's say that you're in the School of the Arts. So LGBTQ people have made an immense impact on film and theater, visual art, etc. But how do you approach this in the classroom? So I remember taking a French literature class once in which the instructor would begin each discussion of a new author with a brief discussion of their biography and usually something about their marriages or their relationships with women, since it was mostly male authors we were reading. But when we got to the poet Arthur Rimbaud, the instructor described his life and then said, and he did not have any women in his life. Pause. So, okay, you know, the teacher sort of cracked open the closet door, but then what do we do with that, right? So, for example, how do we understand the power of the imagery of the drunken boat that Rimbaud, this poet, is using without contextualizing it with this wild doomed love affair that he had with the poet Paul Verlaine? So it's great to put LGBTQ artists on the syllabus or in your events program, but beyond that, you can engage with how questions of sexuality and gender shape these artistic works, how they inform their reception, how they impact the process of canonization. All these sorts of things not only create a more inclusive environment for LGBTQ students, but they also deepen all of your students' understandings of art and society. Now, okay, the arts may be one thing, but what if you're in a field like computer science? Okay, so let's take somebody like Alan Turing, who's getting a little bit more famous these days. So he's one of the most pivotal thinkers in the field of computer science and mathematics. And he was also a gay man who was subjected to prosecution, to chemical torture, and eventually driven to suicide by his government in response to his same-sex relationships. Now, did his sexuality inform his mathematical theories? Maybe, maybe not, but it certainly impacted his life, his career, his reception in his field, and a lot more. So you can bring this up when you're introducing his ideas, if you're talking about mathematics or the roots of artificial intelligence, but you can also connect it to contemporary developments in computer science or the tech world today, where folks are pushing for greater inclusion around marginalized identities. You could share links to advocacy organizations that are pushing for change in this regard. Doing things like that not only enriches your curriculum, but it also lets your students know that you're aware of the issues that they may be facing today, and that you've got their back in their efforts to break through some of these identity-based barriers within the professions that they might be studying to enter. Now, to take kind of an even more out there example, let's say you're in electrical engineering, right? Like, what could have less to do with gender and sexuality? Okay, but when you're teaching about schematic symbols, have you noticed how the language of male and female is used to denote the function of electrical connectors? What's up with that? So it's funny that the ways that these norms of heterosexuality and binary gender have been coded into our disciplines and our teaching methods in 1,000 subtle ways. And each one of those provides a different point of intervention, right? A teachable moment. So whatever field or whatever school or department you're in, if you do an audit of your curricula and your syllabi, looking at it through the lens of gender and sexuality, you may find a lot of unexpected opportunities to create a more inclusive classroom. So thanks for hearing me out.
Thank you so much, Nikita. Vanessa, I wanted to turn to you and ask the question, what does being an ally mean to you?
Awesome, thanks, Ixchel. For me, ally is an action word, right? It's a verb. So when I think about what does it mean to be an ally, I think my then response is, how are you acting in solidarity? How are you showing up? What are you doing? Actionable, tangible things, you know. How are you incorporating, whether it's in a classroom, in an academic setting, or within a staff meeting even? What are you actually tangibly doing to incorporate inclusive practices and model pronoun usage and things like that? And how are you having honest conversations with folks? And so ally, one is a, ooh, I don't know if folks heard my cat. Is a, you know, allyship is oftentimes framed with the community like, I support, which is great, right? But that's a starting point. And so building off of that, and allyship builds from that point.
Thank you. I think now we can turn to you all, to our guests here today, to see if you have questions. If folks have questions, you can just shout them out or raise your hand or put them in the chat, and we'll happy to take a stab at answering them.